Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second day of our international conference. And before we start with something, with today's session, that if it would be half as good as the one of yesterday, we're up for an amazing time together. Nevertheless, Anna and I felt that as co-conveyors of this gathering, we should do a kind of like wrap-up of yesterday's discussions. This is something that we, contemplated of doing yesterday during the plenary session, but both because of time and because of the kind of energy that was in the room and the need to have, immediate responses and discussions of like what has been said, we deferred for today. So we're going to do a very quick summary, which is it's also going to be quite a subjective one, and I think we're also going to add our own critical takes on some of the points that were raised. So it will not be the most objective and elegant and neutral necessarily summary, but there will be an occasion for the speakers to react and to respond.
And I would also like to thank all the speakers of yesterday for preparing really excellent papers and to being so responsive to our proposal. And it was also somehow encouraging to Cosmin and myself, seeing that a lot of the speakers yesterday responded to the new performance turn, the subtitle of this conference. This is something that came out, this title, and the subtitle came out in our discussion and exchanges about the conference. And Andre Lepecki, who was the first speaker yesterday, he actually pointed that according to him, there are two performance turns, one that occurred in the 58-65, which was more a choreographic and dance turn. And in the sense that dance was not so much idea of the collaboration among visual artists and dance, but more the idea of the transformation. And he mentioned Capro, Rauschenberg, Robert Morris, but also Elio Otisika and Lydia Clark. So it was interesting to see the dance, because our idea of the new performance turns also came out because we wanted somehow to throw there the idea that there is this paradigmatic shift that is happening in institutions of bringing more and more dance and live arts into institutions. So having this kind of historical approach of let's call it one of the choreographic of dance turn, as he called it, the idea of the dance is something transformative of freedom, the idea that dance can free from the pictorial image, from the object and so on, to have the fusion of art and life. And what is the new, he said new but not yet new performance turn today, mentioning some of the 5 characteristics that are somehow vitalizing the contemporary art, from ephemerality, scoring, corporeality, I have them here, performativity, and precariness. So this is also the categories that we haven't touched them yesterday. They can also be discussed more. And you want to?
Yeah, because we also here we feel that perhaps discussing this issue of freedom here is a useful operative term as well, because of course freedom is a concept that is very very befitting the entire ideological apparatus of today, and the kind of political and institutional motivation for the presence of live bodies in museums and in institutions today uses the kind of ideological implications of freedom, of in the sense of bringing dynamism and flexibility and fluidity, and breaking the skin of static objects, and in that sense, it is very much serving, of course, the entire ideological apparatus. So, of course, it is, as Andre said, a completely different usage and quality of the term freedom, but this term is not absent in the current performance term, because it's perhaps as an empty signifier, perhaps as something that was completely turn around from its initial, from the way in which it was used during the earlier performance turn, but nevertheless it's part of the items that are vehiculated.
And then another recurrent topic was also the reference to the certain choreographers and dancers, including Xavier Leroy, who was one of the speakers yesterday. So the choreographers and dancers in the 90s, so that certain Bojan and Cvejić call it as epistemological breaks that happen, so certain really radical cuts and way of interpreting dance that happened in the 90s that somehow was mentioned many things, and it seemed also an important reference for the dance in the institutions today. So this is something that was mentioned a lot. And also what connection, if we want to do another connection in institutions and art institutions and dance, the idea of the memory and the experience, because what is really debated a lot is like how we do represent, how do we acquire, how do we transmit the experience and the memory in relation to live arts. And Boris Budin introduced the idea of the cultural conditions and how the experience economy is very much related to memory. Memory is something that is not the somehow recapitulation of the past, but a potential into the future. So there were those categories of memory of the experience of economy, because we were talking in our proposal about the economical and political conditions that are bringing dance into museums, why Boris reminded us that we should talk about the cultural conditions that are enabling that, and there's a history of something that is open, something that is somehow a stage where things had happened, in that relation to look at memory, which I think is something that maybe we could also talk today more, particularly when we talk about institutions and also the whole idea, for example, of collecting.
Yeah, and I think also another point that we wanted to bring in, especially thinking of Martin's presentation, which was like a very useful, I would say, well, it did many things, but it did a clarification of terms, and it did a distinction between dance, choreography, and performance. And, well, he connected performance with the whole apparatus of identitarian theory, and with the post-Judith Butler kind of intellectual paradigm in a certain segment of academia. He connected choreography with a certain structure, let's say, of a culturally determined set of practices and a whole apparatus. And I guess dance was connected to a more organic and atavic manifestation of the body, so to speak. And I think it was important to bring these terms, and I think this is perhaps something that we can revisit. I think also there was a kind of interchanged use of performance and the performative, also in terms of, also in relation to the turn. So the performative turn versus the performance turn, or not necessarily versus, but both were used. And perhaps we can see if such a distinction is indeed important. And besides semantics, I think it's also important to revisit the different turns that were mentioned, because there is the current performance turn, as we call it, which is about the presence of living bodies in museums and institutions and in the whole realm of visual arts. And this is, as our hypothesis puts it, a turn that occurs in visual arts. And then there's, of course, the turn, the paradigmatic shift, the break in the 1990s that was a break that occurred, or a turn that occurred in dance. And I think it's also important to figure out what is the connection between the two. Is there a continuum between what has happened in dance in the 1990s and what is happening now in visual arts? Is it the same general intellectual paradigm that just manifests in different institutional landscapes? Is it are we talking about two different phenomena that are simply connected through the people and through the ideas and through the times, or whatnot? I think here it's also important to perhaps be. Yeah, you can say that. No, but I think it's also important to look at, and this might be a bit more speculative, but to look at a particular sense of a turn in visual arts with the post-war avant-garde, and perhaps thinking of Bojana's understanding of the 1990s and of that turn as a questioning of the basic apparatus of theater, and we can consider that level of break and of rupture had happened in visual arts earlier on, and without being too reductionist about it, but perhaps to a certain extent, from this point of view of the basic questioning of the fundaments of the discipline and of the conventions of the discipline, perhaps what was happening in the 1990s in dance is also, an echo or analogous with what was happening in visual arts at the time. But of course, since these were not phenomena happening in vacuums, of course, this was done by people and artists and intellectuals who were already living in the post-effects of the turn and of the rupture that happened in the intellectual condition. Also, since the kind of intellectual landscape of the 90s was, as Martin, reminded us, so much marked about a certain kind of manifestation of identitarian politics and of post-colonial studies as well, the kind of manifestation of theoretical manifestation of that turn is, of course, different than the one of the 1960s, which had other intellectual fundaments.
And also another, I think, important element that came out a lot of it was all the issues of production and temporality, and the idea of the time, and time also of production, and time of the movement, and time as value, and also somehow the consideration of the two different dispositive apparatus of the theater apparatus and the exhibition apparatus, and how somehow maybe from the 90s already there was definitely moving from the black box to the gallery space. And I think it was also important what Xavier Leroy said, that he was considered for a long time of being someone who is doing a non-dance, and then suddenly now he's invited to museum to do dance. So I think there is also something there that is very, and I think we will be talking about that more today, because what actually happens with those two temporalities of the theater and of the exhibition space, they actually meet each other. So there are different ways how one can deal with them, and I think, as I said, this will be the point of our day. But for sure there was also mentioned this idea of the responsibility that exists between the curator and the artist in dealing with living body in a way in the institutional context, in the sense of the remuneration, in the sense of labor, wages, of course, and also Bona brought up the whole idea of the skilling and dead skilling that is also contributing to that. And somehow we did finish with this, and no.
Yeah, we also had another one of the branches that happened was brought in by Fouquen's presentation, that happened from an assumed position of marginality, and this is also something that started, I think, an interesting polemics later on in the plenary session. In a way, almost as a kind of elephant in the room. And I guess it's also like an ongoing and not necessarily fully resolved or fully resolvable question. But his presentation went on to present certain kind of practices that each in their own way depart from certain kind of like traditional forms and integrate them into the language of what we can call contemporary dance, and even in the institutional landscape of contemporary dance, even if, as Fouquet's point was, it is still a regional or marginal part of the institutional landscape in which these practices are accommodated. And I think at some point there was also an intervention that, when discussing this region, brought in the question of the very strong vernacular culture and manifestation of a vernacular and popular culture that, unlike, the sort of pop culture of the West is not fully integrated into, mainstream culture, and it's still a source of interesting cultural production and with some sort of like emancipatory potential as well.
Yeah, and I think we should already introduce the session today, our second day. So yesterday we had this idea, and I think we managed somehow to have like more a general overview, and today to think, so what is actually happening when we have the presence of dance, of performance, of live arts in institutions. So to have a kind of more closer view now, and to have also different examples, and we invited curators and artists and critics, so it's again like to have different point of views. And
and I think just to because let's say the second half of today with the panel will focus more on institutions, and then the first one will look more at practices, we will start with an artistic practice, and then we will look at something closer to curatorial practices, more or less. I think it's good to remind, when this is something that I forgot to mention before, but when we thought of the different terms that were also mentioned yesterday, and which we should also look more closely, and I think also Bojana mentioned that, of course, there wasn't while this turn and this epistemological turn was happening in dance in the 1990s, the landscape of the turns and preoccupations and horizons in the visual art was actually quite different than what we remember today. So, from the whole, perspectives invested in relational art at the time, to the whole, emancipatory hopes that were invested in the digital turn, and all the prospect of a new, way of building institutions, of a new type of practices, of a new relationship with audiences, a new a new turn that the institutions had to force themselves to accommodate, was happening in the visual arts, and most of them did not necessarily prove to be turns in the proper sense of the word. So perhaps this can also be one of the starting points of today, when we move a little bit closer to visual arts.